Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this interesting, sometimes forgotten subject of protecting your capital from inflation and inheritance tax. We're joined today by NSA Breakfast Club sponsors Rathbones and Roythornes Solicitors. Rathbones is a leading provider of wealth management, asset management and related services to charities like the NSA. Roythornes Solicitors is one of the top agricultural law practices in the UK. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you could put all your questions in the Q&A, there'll be ample time after the two presentations for questions. There are also Rosa CPD points available for today's webinar. So if you can put your CPD numbers and name in the chat whilst the webinar is ongoing, we can get that allocated. Now to our speakers, we're joined by Oliver, who is the head of asset allocation at Rathbones, who's going to discuss inflation in the UK, specifically how this is affecting the economy and what to look out for. He will also discuss ways to protect your capital against inflation and strategies for the future. We're also joined by Joseph, who is an associate solicitor at Roythornes, and he'll be covering ways to protect your capital in the longer term. For example, who inherits the farm and how to ensure that assets are passed on or preserved for future generations. He'll also be covering how to future-proof your business. We've also got William Metcalf here as well today, and he's going to assist in answering some more specific investment questions if you have them. So I'll hand over to Oliver and he can get started this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm going to do the most nerve-wracking part now, which is trying to share my screen and my slides. So give me just a second. Hopefully that will start to appear for everyone in a moment. Nodding heads. Yes, good. So yeah, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here. As we heard, there's going to be a Q&A at the end. So if you do think of any questions along the way, then please do stick them in there. We'll try and pick them up then. Just to give you an idea of what I'm planning to cover today, my talk is split into three parts. So the first two covering the inflation outlook. First of all, some good news. Inflation's falling. It should drop further in the next few quarters. Second, some less positive news. The likelihood that inflation will be a bit higher and more volatile over the next few years than it was, say, during the 2010s, that period of extraordinarily low inflation. And then third, I'll say a bit about how we're thinking about both those positive and negative aspects as investors, how we can adapt to this new inflationary environment. So just to kick things off, let's start with the good news. You can see these two charts of US inflation on the left, UK inflation on the right. In both cases, that solid line, which is showing the headline inflation rate, has already fallen a long way from its peak last year. So in the US, inflation is now back below 4%. It's below 5% in the UK. So clearly still too high, but much better than in 2022. Now, the different color blocks on the charts break down what's been driving inflation, so services, goods, energy, and food. And you can see that we've seen at least a bit of progress in all of those different categories. So the initial spike in inflation was very broad, but we've also seen broad progress recently as well. To understand why that's all occurred and to shed a bit of light on what might happen next, it's helpful to start with what caused that surge in inflation in the first place. So there's some debate about the relative importance of the factors that I've listed here, but I think that all three of them have played a big part. So first of all, of course, we had the pandemic and the lockdowns of 2020. We know that that caused a surge in demand for goods. If you think back to, buying laptops, buying webcams, and so on, and it also disrupted global goods supply chains. So we saw huge delays at ports. We saw manufacturers around the world reporting slow delivery times, low inventories, all of those sorts of things. Now, fortunately, the lockdowns feel like quite a long time ago now, and global supply chains have slowly been healing in the meantime. So those reports of delays, of inventory shortages, they've largely gone away, even in sectors like cars, where we know the problems were particularly severe. So this chart just helps to illustrate my point, really. The lines here show growth in producers' prices for goods. So this is taking one step up the supply chain from the consumer prices that we see in the shops. What happens with producer prices tends to feed into consumer prices a few months later with a few months lag. And you can see that growth in producers' goods prices has collapsed after its earlier spike. So in the UK, it's now very close to zero again. That's the first of our three big inflationary shocks fading. Now, the second shock that I've listed on the slide was, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. That disrupted Ukraine's exports of major agricultural commodities. It saw Russia cut off many of its energy exports as well. And this has arguably been behind the most visible and the most painful parts of the inflation that we've seen. So the surge in our energy bills, the jump in the prices of food on the shelves. So since the start of the war, we've seen the price of a pint rise by 17%, the price of a loaf of bread up by 27%, and energy bills up by more than 50%. Now, even on this, there's some good news. So even though the war in Ukraine is ongoing, the world's slowly been adapting to the disruption that we've caused. And we've seen that inflationary shock to fading. So just on the left-hand side here, you can see the prices of staple global agricultural commodities. They've been falling recently. So not only unwinding the spikes that we saw around the invasion, but falling even further. Again, if we look up the supply chain, we can see that growth in input costs for food producers has slowed massively recently after last year's surge. So that's the lighter line on that chart on the right-hand side there. And you can see that that also tends to lead consumer prices, so the prices on supermarket shelves, by about 6 months. We've seen consumer food inflation slow a little bit recently, but much larger falls are probably on their way in the next few months. Now, it's worth saying a bit about energy too. We know that regulation makes a big difference here. We've got Ofgem, the regulator, setting an energy price cap, but fundamentally that's influenced by what's going on in energy markets. And you can see on the left-hand side here, wholesale gas prices, well, they've fallen a really long way from their peaks last year, again, after the invasion of Ukraine. Europe's been adapting to life without Russian gas. It's built up storage ahead of the winter. It's opened new supply routes. So while our energy bills are still expensive, we shouldn't see another surge like the one we did in 2022. The third shock that's driven up inflation has been a more domestic mismatch between demand and supply. So we saw this leading to the most overheated labour markets that we've had in decades. Measures of firms struggling to find the right workers spiked, so did unfilled job vacancies. And that all reflected a combination of factors, really. On the one side, very strong demand supported by government spending, supported by low interest rates in 2020 and 2021. On the other side, we had limits to the supply of workers. So people have been slow to return to work after the pandemic, not helped by the surge in NHS waiting lists that we've seen. And there have been changes in migration law post-Brexit that have created some sector-specific shortages as well. So this chart shows labour supply in the UK and elsewhere, and you can just see from that dark line that people have been a bit slower to return to the labour force here than they have elsewhere. And that combination of very strong demand and that slow recovery in labour supply has fueled really strong wage growth. So the two lines on this chart just show different measures of wage growth in the UK. But you can see very simply that wage growth has been much faster after the pandemic, 2021 onwards, than it was beforehand. Now, just in the past few months, wage growth has started to fall slightly. It's still very strong, but started to edge down from those highs. We'd expect it to decline further in the coming months. So there's lots of evidence that that labour market that was so overheated is now starting to cool. We've seen the unemployment rate. It was at a 50-year low. It's now begun to rise again. We no longer see so many unfilled job vacancies, for example. Firms no longer reporting having such difficulties in finding suitable candidates. Why has that happened? Well, one reason is that the policy landscape has completely changed. We've had monetary policy in particular tighten very aggressively, some of the sharpest rises in interest rates in decades. That slows down demand, it slows down the economy, it slows down the labour market too. So I've described those three big shocks that drove up inflation all fading. Where does that leave us? What's the outlook for the next few quarters? I think we'll see further falls in inflation back towards central banks' targets. So this chart shows the average of professional forecasters' expectations. Now, I'd always advise treating forecasts like these with a healthy dose of skepticism. But on this occasion, I think that their expectation of inflation back below 3% in all the major economies by roughly the middle of next year makes sense. I think that's likely. So that's actually a relatively upbeat story for the next few quarters. The inflation that's been the dominant economic story of the past year or more fading. But what about further ahead? Of course, we're long-term investors. We need to think about more than just the next few quarters or even the next couple of years. And over that slightly longer time horizon, so in our work that we do planning for the next decade, for example, I think inflation is likely to be a bit higher and a bit more volatile than we got used to in the very calm years before the pandemic in the 2010s. People looking for a return to a world just like the one before the pandemic are likely to be disappointed. I think people often forget just how unusual, how weird in some ways the 2010s were by any historical standard from an economic point of view. So the charts on this slide just help to make that point. You can see a series of UK interest rates going all the way back to the 1700s. So the 2010s and the early 2020s saw the lowest interest rates on record in that entire period. And if you look at the chart on the right, that shows the volatility of inflation. So again, in both the 2000s, the 2010s, inflation was extremely stable, about the lowest volatility in inflation that we've ever seen. So that's really unusual. The 2010s were an exceptional period and perhaps not one that's likely to be repeated. So this slide just lists a few reasons why that might be the case. So the one at the top, in the 2010s, we largely avoided any major geopolitical shocks that had big inflationary implications. But of course, we've just seen from the war in Ukraine what a difference shocks like that can make. Of course, wars and similar events are inherently really difficult to predict. We've recently put together a big piece of work on how we monitor those things, how we prepare for them. But just for the purposes of this talk, the key point I'd stress is that the 2010s saw really unusual stability in this regard. You know, there are key threats in the coming years from China relating to Israel and Iran as well, relating to the future of the conflict in Ukraine too. All of these are possible things that could contribute to more volatile inflation, more ups and downs in inflation in the future than we saw in the 2010s. Meanwhile, there's been a change in government's behavior too. So fiscal austerity was the watchword for most of the 2010s. That's a policy that reduces demand, it puts downward pressure on inflation, but the chances of that happening again seem low. So we saw in the pandemic, governments were reminded of the power of large-scale fiscal policy, and public support for renewed austerity seems extremely limited after years of low investment in public services, for example. I've listed aging populations here as well. There's some debate about this in the academic literature, but at the margin, this is probably an additional inflationary factor. So populations across the largest advanced economies and in China as well are aging. That means a smaller pool of workers relative to the size of the overall population. And that may mean more upward pressure on wages and therefore inflation in the future. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I've listed a couple of further factors. These are ones that there's a bit more debate, a bit more uncertainty about the potential impact of. Climate change is one. The possibility of more extreme weather events might increase the frequency of those disruptive supply shocks that I've talked about earlier. And again, therefore contribute to more volatile inflation. We're also still finding out about how the policies designed to combat climate change might influence inflation. Now, some of them, like taxing fossil fuels, may straightforwardly add to inflation. Others, it's a mixed picture. Investing in cheap, clean energy sources and the grid upgrades that we need to harness them might eventually reduce costs and have the opposite effect. But that might take time to come through. We've seen quite remarkable cost reductions in lots of clean energy technologies, things like batteries and solar panels recently, but these are longer term trends. The final factor that I've mentioned is changing global trade patterns. So just very briefly on this point, as tensions between China and the US have escalated, we've seen increasing attempts to move supply chains away from China. Again, this increased fracturing of the global economy, that's a potential contributor to more inflationary pressure too, as firms set up less efficient supply chains designed to avoid China. I put a question mark by it because it's not something that's made a huge difference so far, but something that we're continuing to keep an eye on. So overall, we're talking about an environment of slightly higher and more volatile inflation than that rather unusual decade of low inflation, the 2010s. I'm not talking about runaway inflation. I'm not talking about a return to the 1970s. We've seen central banks, policymakers show recently that they're genuinely committed to doing what it takes to bring inflation eventually under control, even if they were slow to react. But I still think inflation will be higher on average. So maybe we're talking about a world where inflation averages 3 to 4% rather than the 2% that we saw for most of the 2010s, and more volatile as well. So more ups and downs along the way. That would be more like a normal decade than that, again, rather unusual 2010s. Now, this all brings me on to the third and final part of my presentation, which is essentially what can we as investors do about this change in the landscape. So I've highlighted some key points on this slide. First of all, I've talked a lot about the possibility of inflation being more volatile, interest rates too likely to be more volatile as a consequence. Well, that creates more opportunities for active management in bonds in the fixed income part of our portfolios. We know that bonds prices are very sensitive to interest rates. We can go back to the first part of my presentation for a case in point. I talked about how in the near term we're likely to see further falls in inflation. With that in mind, the Bank of England has probably finished raising interest rates for now, given how far inflation has fallen. So with more downward pressure on inflation in the pipeline, it's possible that it will start to cut interest rates in mid-2024. Now, this chart illustrates the performance of bonds, 2-year and 10-year government bonds in the months around the start of interest rate cuts, just marked by that dashed line in the middle there. Just one simple message to take away from the chart is that bonds typically perform well around the start of rate cuts, and longer dated bonds in particular, so the 10-year bond in particular. And that's something that creates a tactical opportunity for us as investors. So a more volatile environment for inflation and interest rates means more active opportunities. Also, we need to be careful, be continually monitoring our bond exposure. The second point worth mentioning is that it makes sense to stay invested in equities. Now, we sometimes hear questions from clients noticing that higher rates are now available from cash, the highest rates we've seen for a long time as interest rates have risen, and wondering if they might not just be better off putting their money there instead. Now, this chart tries to illustrate that is not a particularly prudent strategy. It's using the US as an example, but the chart would look very similar for the UK. It's just showing you returns from investing in US equities versus putting everything in cash when interest rates are at their peak. So those slightly lighter colored lines show what your performance might look like if you reverted to cash rather than equities. And hopefully you can see from the chart that in most cases, cash eventually gets left a long way behind that more patient strategy of simply sticking with investment in equities. This next chart just helps to illustrate why that's the case. So the reason why equities can help to protect us against inflation is because companies can grow their profits in line with inflation, or historically even a little bit faster. So the chart's just comparing profit growth and consumer price inflation over various long time periods. Companies' earnings have nearly always at least kept up with inflation. Only in really extraordinary historical circumstances have they lagged a long way behind. Now, as part of our strategic planning, we produce forecasts for economies for asset returns over the next decade. And even though in that exercise we're factoring in somewhat higher inflation, somewhat higher interest rates, we still end up with returns from equities that are generally quite a lot higher than those from cash. So again, in the long run, it's very difficult to do better than inflation without staying invested and without a significant equity allocation. Now, I'll cover the final couple of points off briefly. The third one on the slide, we continue to invest mainly in companies that score well on measures of what we call quality. So I'm talking about companies with strong balance sheets, with consistent profitability, ability to service their debts easily. Our research shows that those traits have strong long-term performance records, but in particular, firms with those kind of characteristics should be the most able to weather a world where inflation and where interest rates are more volatile. They've got a bigger margin of error to adapt, reflecting those stronger balance sheets, those stronger competitive positions. So we're prioritizing them. And the final point on the slide, that risk of higher inflation, of more volatile inflation, emphasizes the need for some of the diversifying assets that we typically hold in our portfolios. So going beyond just bonds and equities, but thinking about other assets like gold, for example, like some specialist actively managed strategies that we would typically hold. These generally comprise a fairly small part of our portfolios, but crucially, they've got the ability to do well when inflationary shocks hit. We saw that illustrated particularly clearly in the months after the invasion of Ukraine. So these are really important diversifiers in our portfolio, just to give us that extra bit of protection against those inflationary shocks. That's all from me for the time being. I hope it's been useful. I've just put up Will's details on the next slide. So he is the person to talk to if you have any more specific questions about your portfolio or specific Rathbones related inquiries. But otherwise, I will hand back and stop sharing my screen in a second.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Oliver. Some really interesting stuff in there. And like I said at the start, if you do have any questions, please do just pop them in the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Joseph.
Super. Yeah. Thank you very much, Emma, for the introduction, and Oliver for that very interesting presentation. Can I just double check? Is that the screen's showing? Yeah. Super. Okay. We're off to a good start. So as Emma said, I'm an associate solicitor at Roythornes Solicitors. We're a firm that specialises particularly in agriculture, in that sort of sector, and with landowners, business owners, that sort of thing. My area is so-called private client, so I specialise in wills, tax, trusts, probate and estate administration, business succession, powers of attorney, all that sort of stuff. It's really looking at the individual, the family, and protecting those assets and the businesses. So succession planning is a topic that I talk with clients about on pretty much a daily basis. And yeah, given our particular expertise, a lot of it is farming families as well. So there's an awful lot that could be said. Certainly not a 20-minute conversation and done. But the goal is to cover as much ground as I can, signpost the most important things that we see and discuss repeatedly, and hopefully it'll be of some use to you. So just move slide. Yeah, so what is succession planning? Essentially, it's a plan for the future that seeks to ensure a smooth transition between generations for your wealth and your business. There are four categories there that I typically think about when we're talking about succession planning. So who is inheriting or what's happening next? Asset protection, that's looking after things as best as we can for various events. Tax planning is a bit of a big one, and then avoiding disputes is always got to be a goal of successful succession planning. So yeah, I've tried to sort of succinctly summarize what I think it is about. So smooth transition of a business, it might be continuation, it might be conclusion, it depends on whether there's sort of heirs and successors ready to go. Maximizing and protecting the wealth for generations, and then mitigating the risk of issues and disputes. So I thought we would kick off first with looking straight at what I think good succession planning might look like. This is the sort of my top 10 list. There might be other things that could be said, but I think this is when I'm looking at it, what we're looking to get to. So I'll just quickly whip through them. So I mean, the first step is it's really got to be a well-planned sort of situation. It's got to be communicated appropriately and then regularly reviewed. There are simply an awful lot of people who don't have a succession plan in place. The next slide will cover some of the main reasons why. But then there are a lot of plans that are made, very good plans, and then perhaps not appropriately communicated to the people that need to know. We have surprises coming up in wills when they're read, which is never a great time to try and sort things out. There can be a reluctance for various reasons not to discuss these sorts of things, but the risk of fallout and all the consequences for the business and the family is far too great in my mind. So yeah, that's one of the things that we need to make sure we have as a start. It needs to be in advance of major events. So fairly often we're called in sort of something has happened, some death, ill health, incapacity of somebody, maybe retirement, family fallout, maybe there's a development approach for some land, and we're somewhat immediately on the back foot, which is fine, but there is often a lot that could have been done, a lot of issues that could have been avoided, opportunities that could have been sort of thought through if we'd have been sort of involved earlier. So in advance is a key theme, I think. Documentation is really important. I know a lawyer would say that, but I know plenty of farmers who still work on trust and handshakes. But in this context, it can lead to a lot of issues in future, be that over tenancy terms or evidence we need for tax reliefs with HMRC, or it can just be uncertainty between the family and parties that leads to disputes. So it may just seem like we're preparing a piece of paper, but something properly drawn up and well considered is well worth the cost in terms of how it can legally protect you. I've added in fairness or being fair, mainly as our disputes team see an awful lot of claims being brought on a matter of principle. So somebody feeling wronged or treated unfairly, even if the claim is not successful, the cost and stress is usually substantial. A claim that's notorious to farming families, is proprietary estoppel. Now, this is typically when somebody has worked for low wages on the farm, on insurances that, one day this will all be yours, and it doesn't quite happen for some reason, even if it's for a good reason. Those sorts of litigation claims are horrendous. So what is fair depends on the circumstances, but it's something that we can help advise you on, and with the goal of avoiding any claims late. Intergenerational, the point there is that succession planning happens across generations, and what we want to ensure is that if one generation puts in place some good planning, it's not undone because the next generation does not, or the plan isn't well communicated. So some joined up thinking is extremely important. Once assets have passed on, it's up to the next generation largely to carry the torch. So part of establishing a good business is having a plan in place for it to continue, and you need to start to develop those people that will take that on. Wills and powers of attorney, then they're really important. I strongly believe they're a must for every adult, to be quite honest, yet huge numbers don't have them in place or they're out of date. I appreciate that talking about death and incapacity is rather grim. I'm not the cheeriest of lawyers, unfortunately, although I try to be. But I spent half my life trying to fix problems that could have been avoided, and I'd gladly give up that for helping others to properly plan. I will cover powers of attorney and wills shortly anyway. Partnership and shareholder agreements. So partnership agreements are very important for those operating in businesses together, or perhaps shareholders agreements if it's a limited company type arrangement. Most farming businesses really are still run as partnerships, if not sole traders. So I'll discuss those in a bit more detail, and how the proper partnership agreement is well worth the cost to prepare. It's important that it dovetails with wills and all sorts of things like that, as we see many that don't. But so that's an important thing to make sure is covered off. Tax in mind. The point here is that succession planning is often tax driven to some extent, the main one being inheritance tax, perhaps. There are very valuable reliefs that are available to farming businesses, agricultural property relief, business property relief being the main two, but complications can easily arise with those. The tax framework is awfully complex, and it's too easy to fall into a pothole or miss out on opportunities and pay more than is necessary. So good succession plan will seek to maximise the wealth by mitigating the tax, and I'll just say it's all above board. Land issues, so we frequently see these crop up. It might be unregistered land, lost deeds, boundary issues, land that's passed through multiple generations or to multiple beneficiaries, which can cause all sorts of headaches later on. It may also be tenancies that are undocumented, which is very difficult if you've got the older style AHA unwritten type governing tenancies. And you've got to think about things then such as succession and planning to meet eligibility criteria and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, usually it will be the death of somebody that will trigger trying to piece all these things together, but it is far easier and cheaper to do it in advance. So that has to be good succession planning in my mind. And then just finally on this, so it's really important to have a plan in place that involves other advisors, accountant, financial advisors, land agent. It may include lawyers in other parts of the team, but the point is that it's, you know, far better that everybody has a sort of joined up approach with this, and they know the plan and direction in which you and the business are going, and then that feeds into what they can then advise and help cover as well. So yeah, I do appreciate it's painful enough to instruct perhaps one professional, but we all play an important part, and it really makes a difference when everyone's on the same page there. So yeah, it's quite a big list, quite a daunting list perhaps, but we feel like that is the sort of foundation that everyone should have as their starting point. In some cases more may be needed, in other cases less, but that I think constitutes the good list. So I'll just quickly move on to discuss the reasons why people don't plan, because a lot of time we hear that, you know, there's hurdles in the way of people getting to do the succession planning. So I thought I'd cover what these might be and how we can perhaps get past them. So too busy, I can fully understand that, because I've got my own to-do list and life admin and time rumbles on too fast. But hopefully I can impress the importance of this and why it needs to be prioritised. We often say there's no point working quite so hard to sustain and build your business and personal wealth if you're not covering off all the risks that could be down the track and not leaving it in good order. So yeah, not got around to it as a similar reason, but you know, I've been meaning to do this for 5-10 years is really common. So if I can just encourage you to you know, step that up the to-do list and make the appointment, that'd be great. Difficult conversation to have. Yes, it can be. It can be a gloomy one. It can be quite tough, but it obviously doesn't make the potential issues disappear not to address it. So having the conversation well in advance of issues, you know, when everyone is fit and well, is far easier than later on. And it can be hard to broach the subject with the family, of course, as well. It's not something that's often discussed, but we often hear that it's far easier for families to have that conversation once they've taken the advice, got a plan in place. Not sure what to do. Again, it can be a daunting process, a lot to cover. There can be matters that seem hard to resolve as well. So it may be provision for second marriage or children, sort of one involved in the business and one not, maybe estranged children, but you know, there's often nothing new under the sun, and we'll have dealt with something similar before and be able to guide you through it and have some solutions for that. Envisaging a change, yes, we often hear that, oh, I'm about to get married, or oh, sorry, next generation too young. Yeah, with this one, it might be that the children are minors, or they're not quite involved to the extent you might think yet, and you're sort of waiting to see what might happen. But it obviously prevents a bit of a risk in the meantime. So trusts are often used here to help manage the business until it's appropriate to get them involved, help continue the business. And it just means that there's cover in case something happens while we're waiting to see how things might pan out in future. And I'll cover trusts a bit more later on. So yeah, envisaging a change then quickly. So people might just say sort of, oh, planning to get married, planning to have a child, we're going to bring somebody into the partnership, or there's going to be a major change along the way, perhaps inheritance or gifts, and we'll wait and see what happens. I accept that these might be a cause to review plans, but we would urge that they're not a reason to delay putting in place plans, because there's often a great deal of flexibility that we can incorporate within wills, for example, to make it work now and in the future. And then lawyers being too expensive and complicated, you can try not to sugarcoat it, but legal fees, and you know, I can't say that they're cheap, but what we're advocating here is a thorough estate planning process that takes time to implement and get right. But these are matters of great importance, and it is quite honestly a false economy to try and seek cheap advice, as issues in future will undoubtedly cost more to sort out, if they even can be sorted out, or cause other expenses such as tax and stress. So yes, there is a cost to prepare estate planning, but we would say the cost of not planning can be far greater. So yes, I fully appreciate why these might be a barrier, but we don't feel they stack up when we look at the consequences, which is something I'll quickly address before we look at what we can do. So in terms of consequences, yeah, claims to estates, I think I've already talked about these, but yeah, they're pretty horrendous and on the rise for a multitude of reasons, but it's mainly to do with land values. It's sort of being pretty exponential nowadays. There is more to argue over, quite frankly. The vast majority of farming families who ended up in disputes would say that they didn't expect to be here. And the phrase "my grandfather, mum, dad would be turning in their grave" sadly comes up far too often. So they were just carrying on the business, doing well, building something worthwhile, but for whatever reason, there wasn't a good plan in place, something went wrong. And the personal, legal, or financial ramifications just were such that a claim or dispute arose that needed dealing with. So the plan is to try and avoid those sorts of things happening with a clear plan in place. Disruption to the business, I'll mention this a bit later with partnership agreements, but a lack of planning can be a huge risk to your business and the continuation of it if something unexpected happened to you. And it may only be a term in terms of successor, but it may be where there is no successor as well, and businesses legally dissolving upon death that jeopardizes what you've been working with or working towards. I've already touched upon the land ownership matters that can arise, but yeah, that can be a result of poor planning there. And it can affect the business continuation as well if land can't pass or be used in the way that is intended. So again, that all needs sorting out really. Inheritance issues, so again, without a suitable will, your estate may not pass the way you intend it to, which can easily leave loved ones in the lurch. May not be people that you want either that are administering your estate. So all I would say is please don't assume that your spouse and children will inherit the way you intend. It's very difficult to resolve the issues later on. So yeah, and we can have delays to probate processes as well, which delays administration and then delays sort of the business being able to function as you would want. Deputyship, this arises when there are no valid powers of attorney in place, or perhaps rubbish ones, and somebody loses capacity. It's then an application to the Court of Protection for legal authority to act, and quite frankly is the last thing that the family will want to be doing if something had happened to you. It's an awfully long process, being around 9 to 12 months. So far more cost effective to sort out powers of attorney and have them ready to go, which I'll discuss a little bit more as we get on. And then I've talked about valuable tax reliefs, agricultural property relief, business property relief. Yeah, complications if things aren't structured right, and you end up paying more tax at the end of the day than you otherwise would. There are often opportunities along the way to reduce that, so an early review of an inheritance tax position is well worth doing. We often find that diversification to boost income can sort of cause issues if significant income starts to come from non-agricultural, non-trading sources, so property lets, it might be solar or renewable schemes, and we can risk losing relief indeed on the whole business if it's not properly managed and deemed not mainly then trading. Land identified for development can similarly give rise to tax queries, and advice in advance can help to soften that. So good. The other thing to say that is, it's not to say that those opportunities should be passed up, but it's a case of careful planning to maximise what then is returned for the family. Another key issue we discussed with farmers quite a lot is about the additional inheritance tax allowance. It's called the residence nil rate ban, which was brought in 2017, and it's quite frankly quite a mess of a tax allowance. There are various conditions in which it applies and doesn't, but it's tapered crucially if an estate exceeds 2 million, and this includes the value of agricultural land and business assets, which can mean for many farming families that this allowance is lost. And therefore there's more tax on the farmhouse or on the estate generally. There is often quite a bit of planning that we can do to help secure this allowance without affecting the overall plans. So again, that alone is well worth some advice. Between the husband and wife, that can cover £350,000. So the tax on that is well worth saving. And then the other point to make on inheritance tax is that at the point of death, you largely own what you own, and you're taxed accordingly. So the importance is on getting things planned in advance. We've got deeds of variation, which sometimes are a get out of jail free card, but definitely shouldn't be relied upon. Finally, the assets not protected and passing outside the family. Now, this is a big topic that I could spend a whole webinar talking about, but the long and short of the problem is that if assets are passed outright, you need to be aware of the risks that if a person should remarry, maybe that's the surviving spouse, then it might end up with a new partner. There may be need for long-term care that depletes the capital, and that can be frightfully expensive care. Or the children have some matrimonial difficulties, and part of the family business ends up argued over in a divorce setting. There can also be risks if anyone should suffer financial difficulties, or issues such as drink or drugs, or perhaps a disability of a beneficiary that need carefully thinking about and planning as well. We quite often use trusts in those situations to make appropriate provision while protecting capital. And things can then be managed by trustees for the benefit of somebody without being within their estate or control or grasp. So yeah, this can also be useful for keeping things within the bloodline, which is something we hear requested quite a lot. Good. So just flip over then. So wills, are really important legal documents that far too many people still don't have. You'll see there over 55% is the latest statistic. I accept it does nothing for you, as it only comes into force when you've passed away, but the benefits to your family of preparing something suitable are numerous, really. And having a good will is a good start, but keeping up to date is also key. We held another webinar actually just last night on wills, and there was a live poll. And of those that had wills, 67% hadn't reviewed them for 5 or more years. And I think it was a further 41 or 31% for over 10 years. So an out-of-date will is almost as bad as not having one at all, really. And the risks are just immense there. So I've already mentioned the intestacy rules apply if you don't have a will. That'll often not do what you want, and is a complete nightmare for pretty much all farming families. So given the asset values in question, if there's a farming family with spouse and children, it's not the case that the spouse will just inherit, and it'll be split up in a manner of ways that's often undesirable, it's tax inefficient, and causes all sorts of disputes. So that is a very good reason to get something in place, if nothing else. It's never too early. We recommend them for every adult. Some perhaps want to wait until they've bought a property or got an interest in the business or whatever it may be, which is great. But far too often then they will get busy and perhaps delay. So you can put in place a will whenever, and it will capture your estate as it may be on your death. And you can review it as you go, which is far easier than trying to start from scratch later on. Consider asset protection and tax. Yes, I've already mentioned those, but there are often a number of opportunities within wills to implement some benefits that might be missed if you leave everything to the surviving spouse and straight to the children. So it's worth having a review and seeing if something clever can be done there. Dovetailing with other documents, it's important that wills and partnership agreements, any trusts, powers of attorney, also property titles all link up and all sing from the same song sheet, really. So there are a number of things that can also pass outside of a will, like life insurance and pensions and death in service, if there is, and some jointly owned property as well. So that all needs to be considered so we can have a whole estate planning outlook and make sure everything is covered. It also leads me to mention the need to ensure that everything can be found as well. So we have quite a lot of trouble with perhaps one person holding all the cards. And it's a real shame if pensions and other assets can't be found later on. Or the family put through great difficulty trying to track them down. So details can be kept confidential, of course, and you don't need PIN or security codes or anything like that. But a list of what assets there are to deal with gives the executors a great start. So yeah, final point is about cheap and simple wills. For some people, a simple will can work fine, I have to admit that, but the vast majority of people, especially farming families, business owners, need something a little bit more involved in order to cover off a number of issues, some of which I've already touched upon, to improve their tax position or to make most of opportunities. So it's not it's important not to look at just the cost of the estate planning and the will on the face of it, but in terms of what you stand to gain and seek to avoid. And we say the value for money is then evident. So also a little plug just to avoid, please, homemade wills. So I'm yet to see a perfect one, and far often they cause more issues than they resolve. So moving on then to trusts, you may have got some information about trusts, but yeah, these arise for a number of reasons, and the main ones are set out there: asset protection, tax mitigation. Retaining control and decision making can be important. It's a sort of halfway house to passing things down to the next generation, if you want to retain some of that control and decision making. And then we've got incredible flexibility as well. The be careful part is that tax and trust law is awfully complex. There are some, sadly, sort of horrendous trust arrangements out there that sort of tarnish their reputation, but we use them frequently to great effect, but do be careful about who you use, particularly those unregulated ones selling trusts claiming to avoid probate or guaranteeing to protect assets from care, because more often than not they cause quite a bit of harm. Super. Partnership agreements then. So numerous things that we cover off in a partnership agreement that are best not left to default. So the default legislation is the Partnership Act of 1890, so rather outdated, and a number of things that can cause surprise and difficulty, which I've listed there. This is where there is an unwritten partnership agreement in place. So the two rather big ones are the automatic dissolution upon death of a partner. So if one of the partners dies, the business is technically wound up and sold. Now there's ways to sort of reinstate it almost, but it is effectively a new business that is then taken on, and you've got to wait for things to be inherited, which can be a pain. Whereas our partnership agreements would put in place suitable provisions for continuation and dealing with the partner's share and ongoing use of partnership assets and land in order to avoid disrupting trade. The other one that catches people out is the equal profit, loss and capital sharing type default provision. And even if you have made some alternative agreement, if it's not written down, that can easily lend itself to arguments about who said what and what they were entitled to. The other point to point out with partnerships is that they're often something for sole traders to consider. So the one issue with a sole trader business is that it comes to an end when that individual passes or loses capacity. Whereas a partnership agreement, even if it's perhaps with a spouse, can be a useful thing to provide some continuation whilst succession happens. We appreciate that bringing on the next generation and the timing of that is not easy. Whole raft of things to consider there, but partnership structures, proper agreement in place can be a very useful way to bring children, grandchildren in, whilst you can retain control, ring fence ownership of land and assets. You can determine appropriate profit sharing and salary and sort of voting and decisions. So you can gradually get them more and more responsible. It's not a case of you're a partner and it's 50-50. So we can do quite a lot within partnership agreements to structure that transition. So a high number of disputes arise because of poor unwritten partnership agreements. So that can be avoided with some planning. My final slide then is just about powers of attorney. So these are equally important to a will in my book. So a will comes into play when you pass away, but powers of attorney, if you should lose capacity in your lifetime. So you want to appoint people to manage things for you. I mentioned it earlier, but deputyship is the route if there's no power of attorney, and that's a horrible process to go through. Anyone can suffer incapacity. It's not for the elderly. You know, there are Alzheimer's and dementia type things, but we do recommend them for everybody. You know, sort of car accidents and brain injuries, are horrible to see, but we need to make sure that we're covered legally there. So there's two types: property and financial affairs and health and welfare, which are both important in their own way. So again, they need to be considered in a business context as well and dovetail with what you'd want to do. If there are different attorneys that are appropriate for personal and business decisions, then you can have separate powers of attorney to cover that. Right at the end there's a brief mention about potential issues with directorships. Now, this is because technically a directorship is a personal appointment, so you can't delegate it in the way that you might want to. So, and whether a directorship ends on incapacity will depend on the articles and the law surrounding that. So it can be a little bit tricky. So again, with limited companies, it's important to think about succession for directors and who you would then have in place for management, how new directors would be appointed, and which shareholders could do that, or which directors could do that. So yeah, that needs a little bit of planning, just to ensure there's no surprises in that regard. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover on succession planning in my sort of whistle-stop tour, but appreciate it's a lot of information, might give you a headache, but I hope the takeaway is at least that good succession planning is well worth the time and cost, and failing to plan can be pretty disastrous. So yeah, thank you for listening.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Joseph. We've got a couple of questions for both of you, and I'll start with one that I think is for you, Joseph. So this says, how can you deal with family partnerships? Could I put my share in a trust, or do I need agreement from the other shareholder?
Yeah, well, so it depends. I mean, trusts and partnership agreements tend to go side by side in a lot of ways, because you want to protect the share of the partnership, but also you need to be involved in the partnership for a trading point of view. It all depends on the terms of it, and whether or not there is a need to withdraw assets from the partnership in order to put it into trust, or whether it's held personally and used by the partnership. So long and short is that we set things up very flexibly. So yeah, there is ways to do things, but you know, it's about taking advice and structuring it in the best way. But yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got one more for you as well, Joseph. Is it sensible to replace an existing enduring power of attorney with a lasting power of attorney?
It can be. The enduring powers of attorney, yeah, they predated the lasting powers of attorney that came in 2009 or 12. But they largely do the same thing. We would certainly recommend that enduring powers of attorney are reviewed, but if it's not broke, we don't need to fix it. But what is important is the enduring power of attorney only covers property and financial affairs. It doesn't cover health and welfare, which you couldn't previously deal with. So there is a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. So we do find sometimes people keep their enduring powers of attorney, they're okay with it, but we put in place a health and welfare LPA.
Brilliant, thank you. A question for you, Oliver. At the moment, interest rates are high. Do you see these being very volatile, and how do you tackle this when considering investments?
Yeah, great question. I think this goes back to some of the things that I touched on in the presentation. I think, you know, short term, reflecting that good news that I talked about on inflation, we'll start to see interest rates fall probably sometime around the middle of next year. But crucially, I don't think they're going all the way back to the near zero rates that we saw through most of the last decade. And I think we will see more ups and downs over say the coming decade than we did previously. And again, it relates to some of the points that I touched on during that presentation. It creates more opportunities for us in the bond space to, you know, tactically change our allocation. That's kind of a key lens that we would look at it through when we're managing portfolios.
Brilliant, thank you. There is another one here. What would be your key piece of advice for investing? We sometimes see some companies like Shell recording record profits, but have the share prices just been driven up by demand? And how do you identify a good investment?
Yeah, another very interesting question. I think one thing that I would stress is just the need for having a diversified portfolio. So, you know, that's something that when we're managing a portfolio, we'd think very carefully about. So, you know, not just having too much weight on a specific company where there might be, you know, particular risks, you know, like just some over exuberance on that specific company. we'll try and maintain a broad sectoral balance. We'll try and maintain a balance between asset classes as well. So again, this is something that I kind of touched on in the presentation. It's having equities, having some of those diversifying assets in your portfolio as well. So things like gold, some of those more specialist, actively managed, diversifying assets in some cases as well, just to protect you against the more unusual market environments, the inflationary shocks like we've seen over the previous couple of years.
Brilliant.
The only thing I'd add to that is also to look at the fundamentals of the company rather than the sort of momentum or background noise that's happening. So really look at the main characteristics for that company and how it's earning its profits and revenue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you both. This question is about partners. So I think this one's for you, Joseph. Is it a good idea to have more than 2 partners to keep the business running smoothly if one partner passes away?
It can be. Wouldn't necessarily advocate throwing extra people in just for that sake, but the right people, yes, it can make sense, because technically if you've got a partner that passes away and you're only left with one, you haven't got a partnership anymore. So if you change the structure of the business, you might still be able to continue trading as a sole trader and then set something else up. But yeah, sometimes it can be preferential to keep that partnership going if there are suitable people, but often the partnership agreement will make provision about how new partners are admitted and even expelled if they need to be. So it's again worth reviewing all that and making sure you have the right setup.
Perfect, thank you. A couple more questions if you've all got time. Sometimes money can be a taboo subject, but what are your tips to start the conversation? I think that's directed at you, Joseph.
Yeah, no, it can be difficult, and it's not something you can just suddenly sort of raise on a Sunday afternoon sat on the table. It's a little bit of an awkward one, but you equally don't want to wait for a major life event before you start talking about it. So yeah, it can be tricky. I think we have a lot of clients come and see us. You know, they'll come and chat to us first, come up with a sort of strategy. They might talk with their other advisors as well, come up with a better plan, because it can be a bit of a minefield, and you don't want to start talking to the next generation about money until you've got a bit of a better idea about what they need. So yeah, just maybe have the conversation away from the family first, and then introduce the family. But yeah, we've had round tables as well, which are always fun.
Brilliant, thank you. A question for you, Oliver and William. Can you tell us a little bit more about gold, and how does it help protect us from inflation?
Yeah, great question. This is something that we saw really clearly straight after the invasion of Ukraine. Gold has this really long track record of doing well at times of geopolitical risk, uncertainty, wars, things like that. And we saw in that market environment a lot of the assets that would be the mainstays of a typical portfolio, so equities and bonds for a few months, both struggled. But gold was one of the few things that was doing well at that time. Now, we'd never, it can be volatile. We wouldn't necessarily recommend having a very large amount of it in a portfolio, but a small allocation can be a really useful balance, basically, and protection against those sort of shocks that can periodically occur.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there's just one more for you, Oliver. What are the chances of inflation being much higher for a long time?
So, yeah, I guess in the presentation spoke about the near-term outlook being one of inflation subsiding and then some risks further ahead. But yeah, I'd reiterate, we're perhaps talking about a world where inflation's maybe typically starting with a 3 rather than starting with a 2, so higher than we've been used to, but also not the 1970s, for example. That's something that we'd occasionally get questions about, that people understandably worry about, the idea that inflation will stick at that really high rate for a long time. I would emphasize a few things that are different now to then. One is that central banks are taking the problem really seriously. So we've seen these aggressive interest rate hikes from the Bank of England that have been painful for so many people, but that's part of the process of bringing inflation down. Another one is that just the structure of labour markets, the way the economy is organised has changed a lot too. So a really common feature back in the 1970s was, wages indexed to inflation. So you get, what economists call the wage price spiral, where wages are just chasing prices higher and higher. We generally don't have that now. Unions are not as strong as they were then by a very long way. So we don't see that same process as well. So the specific dynamics that led to high inflation for a really long time then, we don't really see them in place now.
Okay, perfect. One question for you, Joseph. Is it recommended to have a significant other as a power of attorney or a legal professional?
Yeah, so the key rule is if you don't trust them, don't appoint them. So yeah, if it's a significant other, that tends to make sense because they're on hand. They're there to help. They can always go and seek legal advice if they need to. We have others who seem to distrust their family and would rather appoint a professional, or they feel like their affairs are too complex for the family to be burdened with and want a professional, but there's a cost on that sort of element. So usually I say if there's people within the family that you trust and that are suitable, then that's absolutely fine to go with them, and then we can support them as we need to.
Brilliant, thank you. We've just got one more question, and that is for William and Oliver, and that is, what are the most common mistakes you see with investments and people making investments?
I can take this one. The most common mistake is probably people trying to time the market rather than having what we call time in the market, and or losing composure at that sort of crucial moments. It's one of the reasons why investment managers are so important, because we tend to have the sort of research backing there and tend to manage or coach clients through relatively difficult times when they tend to lose composure or want to try to time markets, which is inherently very, very difficult.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that's all we've got for questions. So that was really, really interesting. Thank you all very much. Some really interesting takeaways there. And I'm sure this will be a very good webinar for a lot of people to watch back. So I'd just like to thank you all for your time, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.